We can jump right in. Tell me a little bit about your career and your perspective. You tell me how it's gone.
Okay, yeah, good. I guess you could say I've had three different careers in music. Everything I've done has always been in music since I was a young kid, but three phases. My first phase was as a performer and recording artist. And all I ever wanted to do since I started playing the piano, which is when I was 10, was go on the road and be a touring jazz musician. And I devoted all my energy towards that and did that. Luckily, in my 20, started with John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra when I was 19, and played off and on with John for 5 years in three different bands of his. And in between, worked with lots of luminary leaders all over the planet and toured and recorded. And then started doing my own concerts and my own tours, both as a solo piano, acoustic piano, and also with a trio. And I did one album with a trio plus a string quartet and percussion and woodwinds. And that was my focus up until around 1984. A few years earlier, I got married, we had kids, and we were living in Germany at the time. And I realized that things were changing in the music business, and the touring jazz musician field was not going to be lucrative forever. Also, I felt it was not very effective to be a family father on the road 250 days a year. So I said, what can I do in music and still feed my family and be an effective family father? I said, I'll become a film composer, which I didn't think was so outlandish at the time. I mean, I'd had training, and I guess we can get into my schooling and all that. But I'd had training in composition and orchestration and all that, so I wasn't daunted by the technical aspect of it. But I had no idea the difficulty of the politics. And like I say, we were living in Europe at the time. We moved everyone to Los Angeles. I didn't know anyone, and I thought I was going to be this big film composer. And I took many steps back. And I was relegated to, well, I shouldn't say relegated. I had the opportunity to play keyboards in the recording orchestras in Los Angeles, which was actually the best training I could ever have had as a composer, because I got to see how many different composers solve similar dramatic and political situations in their own style, dealing with their film scores and with directors and producers and how they solve problems. So it was actually the best education I could have ever had as a film composer. So that, I guess, was my second phase of my musical career, was as a studio musician. And my third phase was when I started getting in, when MIDI came out, and I immersed myself in this new world of digital instruments and computers and technology and programming. And I became somewhat of a programmer in Los Angeles, programming sounds in my work as a studio musician, because we were required on the spot not only to sight read music, but to also come up with sounds on demand. As the composers would say, I need something that does this, that, or the other. We had to be able to do that in no time at all. So it was great to learn on the spot and have to be under time pressure. And I built a MIDI recording studio, and my first recording studio in the middle 80s. And I was one of the first guys in Los Angeles to have a functioning recording studio that had sophisticated MIDI and multi-track tape recording for film and television.
That was a huge advantage, I would imagine.
It was. And it wasn't easy. And it's, as you must know as a studio owner, it's a continuous black hole. You keep throwing money in this thing
Yeah.
and trying to keep up with all the technology. And we can get into that a little bit later, I guess. But through my work in the studios and meeting many composers, I found that a lot of them, at that time, they didn't have their own studios. And they needed help. They needed someone who understood the technology, who also could read music and understand reading scores and understand the mindset of what a composer needed to help them finish their scores and get them produced and delivered. So I had, unbelievable training working under fire in the foxholes with all these composers, finishing their scores and delivering them. and trying to make them as high quality as possible while meeting these ridiculous deadlines. So that continued for several years, and then I had some very lucky breaks with some of these composers were involved in projects they got so busy that they didn't want to do anymore. They didn't have time to do, and some of the more generous of them actually recommended me for jobs, which isn't that normal in the music business. Normally, composers are usually a very covetous lot, and they don't give things up. They'll, instead of turning down a job, you take as many as you can and you farm out what you can't do. In other words, hire ghostwriters and people to help you finish the music. So some of these composers were so generous to actually recommend me by name to various projects, and I got my start as a composer, which is my third phase of music business and what I'm still doing today. So I guess I started getting my first credits as a composer around 1989, 1990 or so, and it continues up until now. And in 2004, our family moved up to British Columbia from Los Angeles, which is where I am now, because we wanted to get out of the rat race. I realized that most of my work was done remotely. I rarely ever met with clients. I rarely ever met with directors and producers, maybe a spotting session or going to a screening after the movie or meeting one time before the movie, but almost never during. So I said, man, I could live on the moon or live anywhere I want. I might as well live where I want. So we came up to this beautiful place, and that's where we live. Anyway, that's the nutshell that took too long.
No, not at all. It's great. It's great. I love the three phases. I relate to that. Let me jump around a little bit here. So
Yeah.
I wrote a little note, just listening to the end of what you're saying with the, 1989 and sort of getting your scoring career going. In your mind, was there a moment where you had that first quote real scoring gig, or where you sort of pinched yourself, said, "Hey, wow, hey, I'm doing this." Can you tell me how that evolution did it click? Was it gradual? How did that transpire for you?
It was extremely gradual, and there's a lot of gray areas. Because as a studio owner, before I was scoring for credit, I did a lot of what is called ghostwriting. In fact, I had a whole career as a ghostwriter. And the job of the ghostwriter is to help the composer finish whatever project he has in his own style, so that it's seamless and indistinguishable from any other music that he might have written. And I got to be really good at that. And it's a fantastic challenge and a fantastic learning experience to immerse yourself in the sensibilities of a different artist, and be able to create meaningful scores that make sense and fulfill the dramatic obligations, but still remain in the style of this artist. So, I mean, I've been super fortunate with the different situations I've been in to learn from the best. So I don't regret any of that. But as a composer under my own name, I wasn't doing that. And I first got a chance to do that much later, after I had already been effectively doing that for years. So yeah, to answer your question, there wasn't a bolt of lightning. It happened gradually.
Wow. I want to note for our conversation, what really got us on the phone, which I personally find interesting. Let me describe to you a little bit more in detail. I operate a studio and I have a great team, and we do a lot of television. And when the weekends come, I like to sit back, and hang out with my family. I know you appreciate that too, obviously. And I was watching television, and I'm a fan of mystery and sci-fi and quote scary movies. And I was watching. I flipped around some television, and I saw something on Sci-Fi. There was a show called Ice Road Terror, I think.
Yes.
And my wife would always joke with me like, "Oh, you're flipping through and you can't resist jumping into the Saturday afternoon sci-fi, what she would call and I don't call, a cheesy scary movie." And so I stopped on this movie, and I knew nothing about it, and I was watching a particular scene right in the middle of the movie, and my ears sort of perked up, and it occurred to me that I really liked the music cue. Now that's me. I'm sure the average listener wouldn't be sitting there like, wow, great string pass or whatever. But it just occurred to me. I was like, wow, whatever's going on here, it sounds cool. I was turned on by it. I thought, wow, something's going on here. And that doesn't happen to me very often. Certainly, if I go to a sort of a quote big budget Hollywood movie, I'm always sort of listening for that stuff, but I wasn't in that mode at all. I was just relaxing, flipping around to some television, and it caught my ear. And I just flipped open my computer and said, wow, what's going on? Who scored this? And that was the doorway looking into your career and what you've done. And it was not only the large, the wide amount of scoring you've done, which I respect, and I was amazed, like, wow, this is great. I've really found somebody who came on my radar that I wasn't aware of, and I was really into it. So I started digging in, and then I found your jazz background, which of course I enjoyed because I went to Berklee College of Music, and I'm sort of hip to that world too. So I wanted to temper our conversation with that. That's sort of how I got to you. And
Cool. Brian, I forgot. What is your instrument?
oh, geez, what isn't it, right?
Oh,
Um,
you're a multi
Well,
instrumentalist.
I was a drummer for a long time, and I came up coming out of appreciating classic rock, of course, as a young kid. But I grew up. I'm probably a couple years younger than you, so I came up in the early late '70s, early '80s. So I was listening to a combination of sort of progressive music, but classic rock, and then very quickly into jazz. But when I went to Berkeley, I always share the story that I was in there not auditioning, I was in Berkeley, but you get your ratings. You go in and they rate you for what level of performance classes you can get into. And just, sitting outside those rating rooms, I knew that in 4 years, if I stuck through my 4 years at Berkeley, I would still wouldn't be as good as these great players I was hearing in the audition rooms, in the rating rooms. And that sort of dawned on me. So I really was there to take advantage of the technology. And I know you'll appreciate this because you were building these MIDI studios. Digital Performer and Pro Tools didn't exist at that time. And I was using Kurzweil and Oberheim expanders and a combination of analog and the original DX7. These were the technologies that we were using. So I was getting steeped in MIDI, which was brand new and had, this is mid 80s, and had a lot of momentum. But, I still did study drums, but I knew that, look, I wasn't going to be on the road with Chick Corea. I wasn't going to be on the road with John McLaughlin. Hello. So that's where I came at it. So when I came out of Berkeley, I started managing a studio. And again, you'll appreciate this, a 2-inch 24 track analog machine, analog console, but I started running the MIDI rig. So that gave me a huge advantage in this smaller project studio in the Northeast. So, I started drifting away from being a drummer, I mean, way over 20 years ago now. So these days, what am I? I'm a jack of all trades. So I've got to jump on the keyboards and write cues both as a keyboardist. I would never say I'm a piano player, but as a keyboardist, and also certainly leaning towards synth gear. I took a note when you were talking about doing sessions and having to program synths and get sounds. Hey, I get it. I really do get that. And now that world is very different for us because we can dial up almost anything we need at our fingertips. And
Yeah,
not
we didn't have those tools back in the '80s. That's for sure.
and certainly younger guys coming up now don't understand that. They don't understand we had to understand, filter and resonance and all of this stuff on the fly. It's interesting, how stuff has changed. But anyway, to your point, I mean, what do I play now? If I was going to have an instrument, it might be bass. So that bridges the world of the groove of a drummer, the groove sensibilities, but with the harmonic content. So, I have a number of basses that sit around the studio here, and I love jumping on them when I can. But I'm really the studio guy running the studio joint. Uh,
Cool.
yeah, it's good. But I get to play with I get to play. I get to work. I get to work with a lot of great musicians operating at a very high level. A good friend of mine is Tobias Ralph, the drummer for Adrian Belew. They're out on tour right now. And I get to hang with those guys. And I do miss being the musician, but I get to live in that world a little bit. And certainly I live vicariously through guys like you. And it comes full circle. So I appreciate the work that high end people are doing, which prompted our phone call. So, again, I
Cool.
thank you for, lending your time.
My pleasure.
So we got a lot to cover, and I don't want to waste your time. I want to move a little quick here. I don't want to forget to ask you about a word that you said in your introduction, which is politics. We have a joke around our studio here that, everything is politics. And we certainly do a lot of political work in our television stuff. But could you elaborate on that a little bit for me? Tell me about what politics means to you in that world, in the world that you work in. But elaborate on what your experience was discovering politics.
Okay, well, happy to. For example, I came from a very successful jazz career in Europe, where I was playing to sold out solo piano to sold out concert halls, 5,000 people. I was doing the same venues, the same circuit as Rubinstein and Polini, but I was playing original jazz music, doing like the Keith Jarrett type of thing. And I came to LA and nobody knew me and nobody cared what I'd done. And I was immediately absolutely at the bottom. I mean, I could go to a session and I'd be asked to get coffee for people. And that's what I did. And I did it gladly without an ego, just because that's what I'm calling the politics. I mean, you had to work your way up the ladder. Well, that was in the session world. Just to be noticed in the session world, the politics would insist that you would need to be a congenial, funny guy, tell good jokes, good stories, not have an ego, be easy to hang out with and get along with. And those are the guys that get the jobs, not the brooding, intellectual. So that's what I mean by politics. And the same applies in composition work. The 10 composers might be equally gifted and equally capable. The one who tells the best stories and hangs out and is the most congenial and gregarious, that's the guy who's going to get the job. And it is a little contrary to my nature, because by nature I'm not like that. So sometimes I have to play a little bit of a role playing and try to find something that's more entertaining to talk about than maybe what my nature is. And that for me is political.
In musician circles, we it sounds like you're describing, it's the hang.
It's all about the hang. It's all about the hang.
Right.
The guys who hang are the guys that work.
Wow. What are your thoughts on the way that is now? Is it exactly the same? Has it changed because we're more isolated as creators?
I think it's, the intangible things that politics is one of them, have more importance than they used to, even more, I'd say. I mean, the tangible things, which are your skill, your training, what you're capable of, what you're talented in, all of the things you've learned, and all of the capabilities you have, those are kind of taken for granted. Those are givens. Everybody's gifted, everybody's smart, everybody's capable. But the intangible things about, who's fun to hang out with, who gets me. I mean, it's all about, in the composition world, it's all about getting the confidence of your superiors, the producers and the directors, getting their confidence that they feel confident to delegate their project music to you. And that confidence comes from mainly these intangible things. They have to feel like you get what they're talking about. You have to be an amazing listener. You have to be able to translate their jargon, which isn't musical, and translate it into musical terms that you can understand as a musician, but not tell them that they're ignorant and they're not speaking the correct nomenclature. I mean, that has nothing to do with it. You just have to be able to understand them and translate that to something that you can use artistically to give them what they want. And the people who do that best are the most successful.
Well, we're going to come back to that. I want to ask you first about, tell me about your formal or informal music education. And then I want to get to who your influences are musically. Tell me how you started learning music.
Well, I started trombone at 9. which I loved. I gave it up after 4 years. I loved trombone. I had I had the idea that it was an instrument I could play classically as well as jazz. And I liked that because I didn't want to just be a classical musician. And then when I was 10, I started piano. And as soon as I started piano, I lost that much interest in the trombone. And I studied, my parents gave me the usual piano, classical piano lessons. And I wasn't very motivated. I'll be honest, I was kind of a lousy, mediocre student in my teens because I wanted to play what I heard on the radio. Like when I was 10 and 11, I wanted to be able to play songs that I heard on the radio. And I had my first rock band playing professionally when I was 11. And we played dances and stuff like that. And that's what I wanted to do. Later, as far as influences, I was playing blues. I got interested in the blues, and I loved Jimmy Smith on the organ. And Jimmy Smith, who is the one who drew me from blues into jazz. I played organ for many years. I still love organ. And on piano, I loved all the greats. I mean, Art Tatum, Bud Powell, Oscar Peterson, Herbie Hancock, Bill Evans, of course, Keith Jarrett. You name it, I listened to them, and I loved them all. And I saw as many of them as I could live. Obviously not Art Tatum, but Oscar Peterson I saw, and Keith Jarrett many times. And Bill Evans I actually met a couple times in New York before he died. And I had great opportunity to meet some of my idols, and I heard all of them and was inspired by all of them.
I love hearing about the organ influence. Did you ever spend any time, gigging out with an organ? Where
Oh
did
yeah,
that?
I mean, as a teenager, I had a B3 and two Leslies,
Woo.
and and it was amazing how much help you had carrying it before the gig and never any after the gig. That's what I remember.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I gigged on organ every weekend.
And is that more that the kind of popular or blues stuff, or were you getting into the jazz stuff like Jimmy Smith
Well,
too?
more and more jazz. I mean, I grew up in Seattle. I was born in Boston.
Yeah.
But from the age of 6 months, we lived in Seattle, and there was quite a vibrant, it still is a vibrant music scene in Seattle. And at the time, there were a lot of clubs, and they had the blue laws back then. You had to be 21, maybe you still do have to be 21 to even be in the club. But I used to wear a big floppy hat and sunglasses, and I would be like 13, 14 and playing in these clubs. I was always the youngest guy in the band. And, it started off more rock and pop music, but then it quickly graduated to jazz and kind of bluesy jazz,
Cool.
like Jimmy Smith type stuff.
It's like the Seattle Steve Winwood. Don't tell anyone the keyboard player is 12.
Yeah, he was quite a prodigy, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, he certainly came up, killing it at a young age.
But unlike me, he could sing.
Oh, yeah. So that's a good point. So not a singer.
No, I mean, I can sing background vocals, but I would never consider myself a lead vocalist. I'm a good vocal coach because you don't need a voice for that. But I wasn't born with the rock star voice at all.
What percentage of your career in general, or even just say currently, is vocal music?
Not much. Some. I mean, I still produce artists. My daughter's an incredibly talented vocalist. I produced, I don't know, maybe 60 of her original songs, and we did 2 CDs worth of material for her. And she's written material for many of my movies that I've produced and arranged. And I've worked with a lot of great singers, but I would still say vocally it's maybe 10% of what I do. Almost everything is instrumental.
Nice. I want to get to a little bit more deeper dive on some of the film scoring stuff because I really enjoyed your answer previously talking about translating what the filmmaker wants. I want to get to that, but first let's talk a little bit about the tools of the trade. This is a nice segue from the B3 organ to what we're doing these days, right? So I know you and I had talked earlier when we first connected about Digital Performer, and that's your platform of choice. Can you, in a broad sense, can you tell me what your studio consists of, whether that's a DAW and a console, and can you walk me through the technical tools of your trade?
Okay. How long do we have?
As long as you
uh,
want, actually,
no,
you know,
no, it's okay.
but you know
It,
what I
it
mean.
started. I mean, I am still using gear that I've had at the beginning, believe it or not, which I've augmented over the years. But I rarely throw anything out. Some things I had to retire. I mean, like my wonderful Otari half-inch four-track
Yeah.
with Dolby SR, I had to retire when we moved to Canada because it was just too big to carry. I'm very sad that I don't have it anymore. It was amazing. Dolby SR is amazing. But these days I'm using an analog Mackie console, which I've been using for 20 years now. It's a 32 8 bus, and I've got three 24 channel expanders. And the reason I need so many channels, it's I think 110 channels on input and 230 or something in mixdown.
Wow.
I used to have a very elaborate Digidesign sample cell.
Oh,
I
sure.
had the most amazing sample cell setup I think that anybody ever had back in the early 90s, which was I had an expansion chassis with I think 12 sample cell cards, and I had another two hanging off of my computer. I had 14 cards going at once,
Wow.
and I had my whole custom library that I had built and designed. I started on Kurzweil 250s.
Sure.
I have two of those, which I still have. But the sampling was, even though it was, I think it was, is it 12-bit or 8-bit?
I think you're right. It's
It,
12-bit.
yeah, it was rather limiting, but the programming was so sophisticated that it got around some of those problems. Some of the stuff I originally sampled on the Kurzweil, I still use. I mean, I've translated it now to Mach 5, which is the digital performer sampler. In any case, so yeah, I started on Kurzweil, and then I did this sample cell thing, which was amazing. That's why I needed so many channels on my board, which I still have, and I rarely use now more than about 8 channels.
That was the question I had because at first it sounded
Yeah,
like, wow, you're not mixing in the box at all. You're coming out to all these channels.
yeah.
But now if I hear you correctly, you are mixing in the box a little bit more and you're
Well,
really
I'll tell you, I'll tell you, Brian, and this has evolved over time, but I can tell you with complete assuredness, mixing in the box does not give you the throughput that you get by mixing outside of the box. I've yet to hear it. You always have to turn down levels and compromise and attenuate everything before everything starts crapping out in the box. You can get much more robust levels and get more throughput if you output stems. It doesn't have to go into an analog setup. It could go to a digital setup, which I have also. Let me continue and I'll explain.
of course.
So yeah, I started with Kurzweil, then I had sample cell, then I went to doing everything in the Macintosh in Mach 5, which is, like I said, digital performers sampler. And in the last 4 years, I've been doing almost everything now in Contact, which is the de facto standard, to the point now where I've got a slave computer that I've got a 32 gigabytes of RAM in a PC that I use only as a slave for sounds. And then in my main computer, my Mac Pro, I've got 128 gigabytes of RAM, and everything's loaded to the gills, running, I don't know, over 100 instances of Contact and many, many instances of Mach 5 still, all using Vienna Instruments Ensemble Pro, VEP, as a networking device that networks into my digital performer software. So all of my instruments are loaded at all times. I've got my huge template, my main basic template, which is it's over 100 gigabytes of stuff loaded and always running. And then on specific projects, I'll have additional sounds that I create for that project, what I call my palette. You know, I try to get my palette of sounds early when I'm working on a score. The particular sounds that I find are most indicative of that score, what's going to give it the special flavor. And I save that per project. So I have this, 100 gigabytes or so of general sounds I use, plus the special ones that I'm going to use for that project. So that's all running in Vienna Ensemble Pro into Digital Performer. And I'm using Apogee converters. I've got a Apogee 88000 and an Apogee DA16, which that gives me 24 channels of digital output. And I run everything at 48K 24-bit. And that's basically it. I mean, I got all kinds of outboard gear, and I got millions of plugins in the computer and expanding every day. And it's a fantastic world. And I do almost everything inside of the box. I mean, my mixing setup is all at Unity on
Right,
my analog board. I'm not doing any fancy mixing on the analog. I used to, but not anymore.
right.
Now everything, all the automation is done in the box, and I love in the box mixing. I just don't think that the in the box has the robustness to handle the amounts of level that I like to have. So that's why I'll put a whole lot of stems. Well, not that many stems, maybe 4 stereo stems into my analog board. And with that, I can do just about everything. But if it's a vocal album, I'll use more. I'll use all 24 channels of my digital outs into my board,
Sure.
because I love to have all the vocals coming out of their own stems, and the background vocals and the lead vocals and all that stuff. I like to have about 8 channels of vocals
And I would
coming out.
imagine you have the ability to process those in the analog world, which that might be an option, whether you want to go through
It
it.
is, although more and more I don't.
Right,
I mean, I
right.
got all kinds of cool outboard gear back from the 70s and 80s and 90s that I've kept. And I mean, I've got Lexicon reverbs, I've got, Eventide H3000,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff, which I love, but I rarely use anymore because the stuff in the box is so cool now, and it's so automated. It's so amazing to have everything automated that I rarely go to an analog processor anymore.
So I'm fascinated about, I want to dig into the stems detail of your workflow. And this is still purely the technical side of things. We haven't talked about the creative side of the composing, but the stems, we're all used to working with stems at some level. I want to ask you about delivery. So if you're going to print, basically,
Delivery, I'm an absolute purist. I insist as much as possible in delivering no stems.
right, you want to give the mix.
I want to give them the mix, and I'll tell you why. Because every time I give stems, they end up making their own cues out of them,
Oh, yeah.
which is not what I wanted. It's a necessary evil sometimes, and some projects demand them and insist upon them, and I give them. But I don't like to give, just the choir or just the drums or just the guitar, because invariably they'll leave something out, or they'll change the mix, or they'll offset something in some weird way that suits their purposes, but it just kills the music.
And
So I'm very open and generous in doing remixes as much as they want, and I demo everything in advance, every note of music they've heard 1,000 times, and they can go into as much detail as they want and make me change things. And I'll change the mix. I'll do anything they want, alternate mixes, whatever. I'll give them 5 alternate mixes if that's what they want, and let them choose one. I don't mind to do that, but I dislike delivering stems. Now, this, of course, like I said, sometimes you have to give them stems. You can't get around it. But in general, I don't like to give them stems. I use stems for my own use, just to output more audio into my analog world,
Yeah.
because I think it sounds better.
This conversation is fascinating to me, because this is that workflow piece of, how do we get from A to Z? And I love talking about the letter M and N and right in the middle, like where are we at?
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time. I want to get to the film scoring deep dive a little bit. I have one more question on your workflow. Can you elaborate how, I'm going to use this word in quotes, how a typical scoring project, how does that workflow roll out for you from the phone call, email to you, hey, here's a new gig for you, all the way to you're done and you're paid? Can you elaborate what that process is for, as I,
There isn't just one process. It's very individualistic depending on the team that I'm working with, and it's always a collaboration. And I don't try to impose my way of working overly on people, but I do give suggestions and say, this is the way I like to work, and if that works for you, that this is what I have found has been useful for me. For me, unlike many composers, I like to compose in show order, meaning I like to write the music as I see it on the screen.
yeah,
I get the gig, I see the movie, I listen to the temp music, I see their rough cuts, I see the fine cut, I see the final cut. I usually don't start writing until the locked picture, because I hate changing things.
yeah,
And I'm a very intuitive person, and musically, when I get an idea, usually the first idea is the best one that comes out of me. I'm not one of these guys that labors, and I'm not making a value judgment, because some composers work better when they labor over things. I mean, I think Beethoven was one. He would agonize over one melody for like 3 years,
yeah.
and scratch it out and rip it up and have tantrums, and finally arrive at the most amazing music ever, after dealing with it for years. And other composers like Mozart, it would already be written in their head before they would even write it down.
Wow.
I mean, completed. Mozart would just write out the parts. He wouldn't even write out the score. So there's, and everything in between. Well, in my way of working, I'm more of an intuitive guy. So I see the picture, I get a gut reaction. I like to go with my gut because it's usually the most honest and usually the best for me. And I like to write in show order, which means I start at the beginning and go straight through chronologically till the end. And that's how I like to work. Some people don't like that, and if they don't, I can work other ways. I mean, there was one movie, there was a baseball movie I did a few years ago. The director wanted me to do the biggest and most climactic cue first, which I did, and then I worked backwards. And it was fine. I can do that. I can divorce myself from chronology if I have to. It's just not my preference.
Why did that happen? Did they particularly need that emotion? Why were they asking that?
This guy was an amazing director, a really nice guy, and he just had this devotion to theme and continuity. He wanted everything to be related to the theme, even the effects shots, the slow motion baseball pitches with the ball curving and doing wacky stuff. He wanted that to be theme. He didn't want, normally I would go to sound design for a shot like that. He wanted it to be musically thematic, related to the theme of this baseball pitcher who was and in any case, it was I learned a lot from that. It was a really cool concept because like I say, I would normally go to some backwards, slowed down, sound design for a slow motion shot of a baseball curving in space, taking 30 seconds to get from the pitcher's hand to the batter. But he wanted it all to be thematic, and it really, I got to say, it really worked great. And I'm glad that he made me do that. And in any case, he wanted that first. He wanted to hear that first. And then once he was satisfied that all the themes were working, then he basically left me alone for the rest of the movie. And I filled everything in after that.
Wow, it's fascinating. I mean, I in conversations like this, I tend to want to generalize in my questions, I want to ask you, well, is it most times this? But I really get the sense that every film is different and obviously every score is different. Tell me if I'm right or wrong. That must be how you approach it every time the phone rings. Like, what is this going to be like?
Yeah, I can't have a preconceived notion because if I did, every score would sound the same, and then I wouldn't work. So
do you ever catch yourself doing that?
I've got to be open and adaptable, and I take great pains to do that.
Do you ever catch yourself, kind of writing a cue and going, "Ooh, I've done that"?
No.
Good. Wow. I can't even imagine. It's amazing.
I've been very fortunate to, I realized early on that I had a gift to come up with stuff creatively, and I try not to abuse that. I try to honor it, and the way I honor it is when I'm working on a project, I am like totally in that project, and I don't let anything else interfere with my concentration on whatever it is that I'm doing at that moment, and that becomes supreme.
I don't want to interrupt your larger answer on workflow, by the way. We were talking about getting, a lock edit or, having to do single cues. Land the plane for me, bring me further down the end of the path.
Okay. So in a typical sense, I'll start with the main title. I'll start at the beginning of the movie and I'll write the main title and I'll write the whole movie, cue by cue. I'm a complete open book with the teams of people whom I work with. So I always deliver every cue as a quick time for them to comment on. I have a client area on my website where I post my work in progress, which will be a quick time video with the production sound that they've given me and my music dubbed in there at a relatively low level, hot enough so they can hear it, but not so hot that it's overbearing. And a lot of times that's political. Going back to politics, how loud you put the music in your demos is a political thing. Because if you make it too loud, they're going to hate it. Because they're never going to dub it that loud. And if you make it too soft, they'll say the guy doesn't have enough confidence in what he's written. He's trying to hide something or get something past us. So, you have to have confidence, but you have to be sensitive to the fact that other people don't ever like to hear the music as loud as musicians do.
True.
So anyway, to continue, it says, so I deliver all the stuff. They either sign off on the cue or they don't. And we might have, usually many more variations at the early part of a movie than later on. I might go through 10 revisions of a main title, or an early character theme or an early scene might have 10 or 12, 20 revisions. I'm not 20, but maybe 10.
Right. Right.
Later on, there might only be one or none, which is, of course, more satisfying. But I handle it all. And once cues are signed off, I always keep a running. In Performer, unlike in Logic and Pro Tools, I can have multiple cues in one sequence. I can have the whole movie in one sequence
Right.
as individual cues. And then I always have the whole show cue up. And by the whole show cue, I mean I've got the entire picture from 10 seconds of pre-roll prior to the start of the picture until after the end of the end credits in one chunk, in one sequence there.
Mm-hmm.
And I have the production audio as a stereo stem. I have the temp music there available, and I have my cues that I put on various stems. I do deliver in stems in the sense that I have A, B, C, D stems. As cues are overlapping, source music I put on a different stem. Any kind of overlapping cues, obviously, I have on different stems. And I use a lot of overlapping cues because something might be fading out while another one is fading in. So anyway, I assemble this final show sequence, or chunk, I'll call it. The Performer calls them chunks. So I have this final sequence chunk that I'm working on from the very first day until the end. And finally, all the approved music of the show is in this one chunk, in order, locked to picture, each on separate stems as it needs to be. The most basic setup would be an A stem and a B stem, and all the odd number cues would go on the A stem and the even number cues would go on the B stem. And then when I finally deliver, I export that via OMF or AAF to Pro Tools. And I deliver in Pro Tools because that's what everyone else uses.
Oh, that's interesting. Sure. Good. That's a good
So
detail to point out.
I have Pro Tools, believe it or not. I'm not very conversant in Pro Tools, but I know how to open it and make sure everything's working and check it and make sure the frame rate is set right and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I deliver in Pro Tools. I assemble this chunk in Performer as cues get approved. I assemble this thing. It's always frame accurate. And at the end, I take that entire chunk with all those stems and I convert it to a form that Pro Tools can open. Then I open and save it in Pro Tools, and I deliver the Pro Tools session.
And assuming that's all electronic these days, right? You're just delivering it electronic as a download.
Well, I always use at least, as many live things as I can. Budgets don't permit many these days, but I always do, acoustic piano.
Let me rephrase my question. I'm sorry, that's not what I'm asking, but that's a great answer. I want to get back to that, actually. I was saying delivering to the filmmaker or the studio.
It's electronic. It's all done over FTP.
Right. There's no one shipping hard drives anymore.
No, it's not necessary. I mean, the internet is so fast now.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to interrupt your question about the acoustic instrument, so that's an excellent segue. So please tell me about, you're tracking your acoustic piano. It's something you have at your studio. First, tell me what piano you have.
It's a Yamaha Conservatory Model C.
Right.
I think it's a C. It's 7'6". It's not the 9 foot. It's the one just below the 9 foot. And it's a disc clavier, which means it reads and writes MIDI, which is incredibly helpful in scoring. So I can take thematic material, I can transpose it, change tempo, take sections from here and there, move them around, insert odd metered bars and whatever, and change things and not have to re-perform the whole thing.
And you're expressing yourself on, a very high-end instrument at the same time.
Well, it's a gorgeous instrument. I've got beautiful microphones and mic pre's, and there's something I'm sure as a studio owner. There's something about instruments moving air into microphones that it's different than samples, even though samples are recorded the same way.
Yeah.
There's something special about it being performed by a live instrument. And I always at least use the live piano. And, as budget allows, I might have a string quartet or some woodwinds or something, but usually budget and time doesn't allow. Usually almost everything is MIDI these days.
Well, I was going to ask about timeline. Can you generalize about that? How fast do these scores get done? I assume you're under a lot of pressure.
The quickest would be about a week, and the longest is maybe 2.5 to 3 weeks.
Wow.
The very longest.
Wow. And that's feature length work.
That's 90 minutes of picture, And for the 90 minutes of picture, I might have written 4 hours of music, including all the variations that got rejected.
And do you find that? I mean, my jaw's on the floor a little bit. I mean, I know how this world works a little bit, and just thinking about, wow, a week to 2 weeks to put out that much music and have it be original and emotive. Wow. I mean, I'm not blowing smoke up your skirt. I mean, can you confirm, like, geez, this is a lot of work?
Well, it is a lot of work, and I don't sleep much when I'm working, and my wife could tell you. So I'm a little bit fanatic, I guess, when it comes to that. But I get on a creative binge and I just blast. I just blast away, and I like to work like that.
I mean, are those long days? I mean, we're talking 20 hours. Like, how does that work?
We're talking long. We're talking, 3 a.m. till 10 p.m.
Wow.
kind of days.
Is the dynamic at all, I mean, do you have the director calling in and riding you, like what's the temperature? Do they just leave you alone?
The temperature is usually pretty good because, like I say, I'm very forthcoming with my work in progress. So they can always check in and see what's happening. I respond very well to comments and criticism and collaboration. So there'd be no reason to have a high temperature because everybody knows what they're getting.
Yeah, yeah.
And if they hate it, they'll tell me, and I'll fix it.
I want to try to move us along here. Again, being respectful of your time, you're being very generous. I'm fascinated about synchronization. Now in the coming out of Berkeley and in the audio world, a lot of musicians, they never run into synchronization or time code until they get into the world of video. Now that's more common these days, obviously. But can you tell me a little bit about how your studio is synchronized? I know you mentioned you have a slave system. Can you elaborate on that for me?
I can tell you exactly. There's two kinds of sync. There's SEMPTI sync, which is hours, minutes, seconds, and frames, which corresponds to the frames of picture that you're scoring. That's one kind of sync. And then there's house sync. That's an audio sync. And I use, since the early 90s, I've been using digital house sync. I've got something called an Aardvark ArdSync 2, which delivers a digital word clock. And every piece of gear in my whole studio here, and I've got an expander that splits that signal. Every piece of gear has a word clock input, and everything is religiously synced to this digital word clock. So all my gear is frame accurate, including the slave and everything. Well, the slave gets it synced through my main computer, but digital word clock is running the whole show. And I don't do anything with internal sync ever. It's always external digital word clock coming from this one device. And by the way, that digital word clock, I discovered this in the early 90s when the DA88s came out, and I used to have 3 of them. And some projects I rented 5 more, and I had like 8 DA88s, which originally were 16-bit recorders.
Sure.
As soon as I got digital word clock sync, it sounded so much better. I couldn't even believe it. Everybody heard the difference.
Wow.
And the stuff that I recorded back then, I listen back now, I don't really hear much difference between that and what I'm doing now. Of course, I hear the difference between 16 and 24-bit. But everything that's locked to house sync sounds so much better. So I became a convert, and I have never done one note without it.
And we use an Aardvark here too, and I would agree with you. I think it's an underappreciated technical aspect.
Well, that's cool. I don't even know if they're still in business. I mean, I got mine 25 years ago or something, and I'm still using it. It hasn't been off in 25 years.
Yeah, well, exactly, right, with a little green light on the front, right?
Yeah. So in any case, and as far as the SEMPTI time code, I mean, back in the 80s when I started, we had to have all kinds of elaborate syncing gear. It was so complicated to sync these analog tape machines and multi-track tape machines to time code. And I had, very expensive sync gear and all kinds of stuff, which none of that we need anymore.
Right.
Nowadays, there isn't even an audio SEMPTI code. We never use that anymore. Everything's locked with digital word clock. We don't need it. I look at the numbers on the screen, and as long as I have the frame rate set correctly, which the first thing I check, as long as I have the frame rate set correctly in Digital Performer, everything is frame accurate. So I never have to worry about SEMPTI sync, ever. As long as I set it up right, and sometimes I have to figure out some weird offsets. sometimes they don't give me pre-roll, or sometimes they give me funny pre-roll that has no window burn time code, and I've got to figure out, I got to do all kinds of math and trial and error and whatever, hunting and pecking, and figuring out what the offset is. Once I figure it out and save it, I never have to worry about it again.
It's amazing. I mean, I remember the day of striping 24 tracks with
Oh yeah,
SMPTE, and yeah, it's a different world.
Links. That's what I used to have. Links. I had a
Yeah.
very expensive, and it worked great, but it was a pain in the butt.
And it was expensive. Yeah. It wasn't
Yeah,
a
I had
simple
links
thing.
and a couple slaves, and I forget what they called them, but it worked amazing. But
The
you don't need to do that. Well,
timeline.
of course, if you're having an analog, if you still have your analog 24 track,
No, no. Yeah, it's
yeah,
all
because
all
you would
gone.
have needed that for that.
I have a Studer 2 tracks, the only analog piece of gear we have.
And is it chasing time code, or do
No,
you ever stripe it? Or
I haven't even I don't remember when I turned it on last.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, in any case, nowadays, you can do amazing things digitally, and you don't really need it, in my opinion. I did dearly love, like I said, Dolby SR
Yeah.
and the half-inch 4-track.
Yeah.
That was probably the best sounding recordings I ever did, just
Sure.
from the sound of them. But that format's no longer,
Yeah.
at least not for me.
I have a generic, I'm going to try to pivot here a little bit. I have a generic question about business, which is when you're, quote, doing business on these jobs as a film scorer, do you work with an agent? Are you personally doing the business with the studio? Do you have
For,
representatives?
for years, I did it myself, and for the last 3 years, I've had a wonderful manager who now does all that for me.
And is that manager also, quote, getting you the jobs too, or is it purely just
Generally
handling?
not. I mean, I can ask him for help if I want to pitch something, and it's much better if a third party pitches you than if you pitch yourself.
Yeah.
I found that to be way more effective. But he's got many clients. I can't expect him to be combing through every possible job that might be good to put me up for. Although he does sometimes. Generally, I've got to find my own work, but he will pitch for me as directed, and he does a great job.
And in the manager, as this role, are they also handling accounting for you, or is that different?
No, that's different in my case.
Yeah.
No, that doesn't handle accounting.
Right.
He handles he handles contracts and
Right.
negotiation and
Right.
all that kind of stuff. But accounting he doesn't do.
Got it. It's not under the same umbrella. Right.
Not at all.
Good. I want to try to land the plane here. Again, we've been talking for more than an hour, so thank you again. Tell me about, as a musician, as a composer, and I really like this idea of, that first instinct when you sit down and you're looking at picture, you're looking at those opening titles. Tell me about, this is the intangible to the people who are not musicians, to the people who are not in the film scoring or entertainment business at the level you are. Can you give a glimpse into what that world is for you? When you sit down, can you try
Well,
to,
I usually don't get a blank page, to be honest,
do you mean
because
temp
they
music?
always put temp music on there.
Fascinating.
And one of my biggest jobs initially on any project is trying to discern how much they love or hate their temp music, because usually it isn't the director who puts the temp music in. It's usually some assistant editor.
Yeah.
They need to put something because the director needs to sell his cut to his superiors. And it looks, it sits there like a dead fish if it doesn't have music in it. So they put some temp music in it, and the bane of most composers is trying to fight the love of the temp music. And I've had to encounter that lots of times. I mean, they'll temp with really expensive scores by Hans Zimmer or John Williams or Jerry Goldsmith, scores that cost $6 million to produce with a cast of thousands, and they give us a Wurlitzer and a hot dog and say, chop that. It's not so easy. That happens a lot. But usually they understand that we don't have those kind of resources on the type of projects that I'm working on. So my first job is to find out how much they love the temp music. And then my second job is to say, well, what can I take from what they've told me about how much they like the temp music? What can I take from that, and what can I bring to it that is sincere and has integrity with where I'm at artistically? Because I never want to just copy the temp music. Sometimes I'm asked to do that, and I can, of course. I know how to do that. But I don't feel is my job. My job is to come up with something original that hits all the bases for them as far as what they liked about the temp music, but is also original, and that I can put my stamp on and say, this is my contribution.
I would imagine there's also an expectation sometimes you have to absorb. As you mentioned, here you are listening to, John Williams score that's recorded with the London Symphony Orchestra. And you probably still have to fight that expectation that you have to go into your Vienna samples and, live in that world a little bit.
Sometimes, but a lot of times I'll do something like completely opposite just to get them off of the temp.
Yeah, good point. How much do you do that, do you think?
I can't generalize.
Right,
I mean, it depends on, like I say, I'm very intuitive. I go with my gut. And my gut has never failed me.
That is really a great point. So you may sit down and say, this is going to be a solo piano piece with an oboe or something. And if that's what's coming out in your head, you're going to go with it.
I may, it's hard to say. Of course, everyone loves to have wonderful, lush orchestration. We all do. I do. But a lot of times that isn't what a scene needs. Sometimes the scene needs silence. Sometimes the scene needs, one high string holding for 45 seconds. You have to really be open-minded to go where the scene is taking you.
Now, you just touched on something I'm so glad you mentioned. I would have missed is when you choose not to score. And I was watching something the other day, and there was a whole long passage where there was no dialogue. It was just nat sound, really, of the scene and just physical action of a character moving from one place to another. And I said, wow, I could imagine not just the composer, but the director wanting to score this, but they didn't. And that's really interesting. Can you tell me about that?
I can't take 100% credit for the spotting of the music because that's a collaboration, usually between composer, director, and even the producers about choosing which scenes to score, where not to score. That's always a collaboration. Those decisions are made in collaboration. But, if left to my own devices, it's really important where music comes in and even more important where it goes out and where it stays out. And usually in the better quality productions, there's less music. And conversely, in the cheap ones, there's more music because there's a lot of times they want to use music to so-called fix things that they're not happy with in performance or in editing or in lighting or in whatever. And that's always a losing proposition. But sometimes I'm asked to write more music than I probably should for a certain project because there were deficiencies that they want to cover up. But like I say, usually the better productions have less music, and as a result, the music that's there is more meaningful and can make more of a meaningful statement because you need to have contrast in order to make a statement. You need to have breathing room. You need to have places for the ear to reset. And, most importantly, music in movies is not supposed to be noticed.
Right.
If you notice it, the composer's doing a shitty job.
Right.
I mean, you want to be drawn into the scene subliminally, and the music can help you with that. And you want the music to enhance the subtext of what isn't being shown and what can be said subliminally about characters that maybe you don't see on the narrow level that you might see on the screen, but some of the deeper feeling elements the music can help with. But you don't want to give away too much with the music. Then you're doing a rotten job. Then you're like scoring cartoons,
right.
Which I also do, by the way. I like scoring cartoons.
Tell me about that.
In film music, you don't want to give away too much with the score, and you certainly don't want to be noticed. And that's the complete opposite of what my earlier career as a jazz musician, because that's all about being noticed.
Tell me about the cartoon work. I mean, we all know the phrase Mickey Mousing, right? So, tell me about your work with cartoons.
Well, I work with the best guys in the business, bar none. I mean, there was a whole revival of Warner Brothers back in the 80s and 90s, and they redid the Tasmanian Devil. I was involved in the cartoon series, 65 episodes. And this was done under a tremendously low budget, and we did an amazing job. And I was the orchestra, and they used to fax me, and the orchestrator. They would fax me the scores, and they were full orchestral scores. And I had to sequence the whole thing, for orchestra. And then we had a small live group of 5 guys, drums, 2 woodwinds who doubled on everything. I played live piano. Half a day we had a violinist and a trumpet and a trombone, and that was it. And the rest was all in my Mac on my portable rig that I would bring to the studio once a week. And it was 23-minute episodes with everything under the sun written in complete honor to Carl Stalling, who invented that style back in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
That's, the Warner Brothers style of music, Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and all that stuff.
Yeah.
He was the originator of that style. Anyway,
Sure.
there was a revival of that in the late 80s, early 90s in LA, and I was really fortunate to be part of it. So I learned from all these guys that were scoring in that style, and I got to score some cues. And later I worked on a cartoon series called Adventures from the Book of Virtues, which is a PBS show. And I had a fantastic composer I worked under for a year, and then he left the show, and I actually got the show, and it was great.
Let me clarify something with the Tasmanian Devil. Those scores you're talking about. You said the scores came in faxed, so there was a composer writing, and then you guys.
I wasn't composer on that series.
Right.
I was the orchestrator and the programmer.
Oh man, wow, that's quite a hustle. All that amount of work.
Oh man, it was 23 minutes of 160 beats per minute. 16th notes all over the place. I mean, you won't believe how difficult that was. That got my chops up in a big way as a sequencer.
Wow.
As running the sequencer and also in orchestration. It would be like 5 composers writing 23 minutes of stuff, and we would record on Saturdays. And invariably, I wouldn't get the first cue until Friday, 2 in the afternoon.
Oh my
and
God.
I'd be up all night. My fax machine would be like reams of paper. It'd be like, I don't know how many hundreds of sheets of paper per episode. I had to sequence this whole thing, have it ready, and then the cartage company would come at 6 in the morning, take my stuff and set it up in the studio. I had to hustle, get there with no sleep, and I had to run the clicks for the 5 guys.
Wow.
The warning clicks and all the tempo changes. And in cartoons, there's billions of tempo changes. And it was a fantastic training.
Well, talk about sequencing chops. You're right. Was this on a Mac SE 30 or something? What was that rig?
It was the little Mac SE. Yeah, I think it was the SE 30
with the floppy drive on the front.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah, I get it. I feel
amazing.
you.
And this was pre-digital Performer. This was Performer.
That's right. Yeah, there was no embedded digital audio. Right.
None. But it was all MIDI. It was super reliable, super great, and my clicks were a sample. It worked super. Wow. Never crashed, never had a problem, and this is like 65 episodes, 23 minutes of music each time.
Well, listen, I could literally talk to you for 2 more hours on music and jazz. We didn't even open that door. I want to wrap things up because we're just getting too long, and I'm really enjoying the deep dive. So again, thank you. I can't thank you enough. I want to ask you just 2 questions. One is, what's the biggest thing that you'd like people to know about you that people don't know about you?
I don't know what people know about me. Like I say, as a composer, I shouldn't be noticed. So hopefully they don't know. Hopefully they know the projects that I work on and they like them. And that means I'll get more work.
Well, how about this? I get that. I understand that sentiment. In other words, if people were knowing about you, you're not doing your job. Okay, thank you.
Exactly.
Let me flip the question then. What's the one project you would like people to know you've done?
That's hard to do too. I mean, they're all my babies.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I'm proud of all of them. I mean, I guess my last one is always my favorite, right?
Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. Well, what is the most recent thing you've done? How about that?
Most recently, I did a documentary, a fantastic documentary. It's called Triumph, The Untold Story of Perry Wallace. And Perry Wallace was a black Southerner from Nashville. He was the first black varsity athlete in the Southeastern Basketball Conference varsity in 1966.
Yeah.
This is like 100 years after Lincoln declared emancipation. Mm-hmm. There was still segregation in the South, and blacks weren't allowed to play varsity sports in any of the universities. And this guy was an absolute pioneer. He came in with so much hostility and racism, and he broke the color barrier.
Wow.
So this all interviews with people from that era. They have archival footage. They got interviews with him. He's still alive, and talking about his memories of what happened, and they reenact some things. And it's a really great documentary. Anyway, it's a feature-length documentary. I'm not sure when it's coming out. I think in the fall as a feature, as a theatrical feature.
Nice. And you've delivered. You're done.
We're done.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm done.
Wow.
But that was big. It was a big project, lots of music. I had to do, lots of different styles. And documentaries are always a challenge.
Sure. Yeah, we've done a little bit of that here, and it's an interesting animal,
Yeah.
Wow, that sounds like a
So
great
that's
project.
the most recent one. And just prior to that, it was also an exciting project, the video game score to Capcom's Dead Rising 4.
Oh, wow. I didn't even open the door of video game scoring. I didn't even get there. Oh,
Yeah.
geez. Wow. Dead
So
Rising
I
4.
was one of I think 6 or 7 composers who contributed to that score. There's 14 hours of music or something, a ridiculous amount of music in there.
Yeah.
I wrote some really cool stuff. There's some samples on my website if you look.
We have some
Uh,
ancient history here with Blizzard Entertainment and sort of the gaming industry way back. But
yeah.
that was I dipped my toe in that world a little bit, you know, producing a little bit. Okay, so here's my big final question I like to ask. So the phone rings, right? The other person you talk to, when you hang up, they have solved your biggest problem or concern. Who was that person and what did they solve?
Jeez, man, I don't know. I mean, I'd love to get a call that said I've got work for the next 40 years. I'll take it. I don't know what to say, pal. I mean, every situation has its own parameters. I've been real blessed, and I feel happy about life the way it is. To be honest with you.
Good. I like hearing that. I like hearing that. That's cool. You're doing great stuff, and it's a real privilege to talk to you, Stu.
All righty, Brian.
Cheers.
Take care, pal.
Bye bye.
Bye.